I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Rachel Bovard.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We have a really good show, as always, today. The topics, I think, on this particular episode are fascinating, and we're going to go right down the list. We have private platforms being used as government censors. Rachel, of course, could have predicted, is going to tackle that subject for us. We're then going to talk about critical race theory, really, which has become one of the hot button issues, sort of, I think appropriately, but very randomly has sprung to the forefront of our national discourse. We're then going to talk about the Chinese Communist Party's legacy at 100 years. Ben is going to help us discuss that. Then we're finally going to close off with the male friendship deficit. There is new information on just how bad it's gotten. So with that, I'm going to toss to Rachel, who's going to take us through this private platforms being used as government censor topic.
So the piece I'm using to base this discussion on is actually a Substack from Matt Taibbi, who has done a lot of really good sort of reporting on this phenomenon, which I like to say I've been writing about for 2 years now, to much initial mockery, I think, from a lot of people saying, there's no way that, these private platforms like YouTube, Facebook, even Google can engage in anything close to censorship. Private platforms can just not rise to the level of censorship that the government can do. But I think what that statement left out is this crucial nexus that we're seeing now that really COVID brought to the forefront of private platforms colluding with the government to push a specific narrative. And we're seeing this, I think, especially around scientific information, I think in really troubling ways. So Matt Taibbi talks about this specific instance of Bret Weinstein and his wife, their podcast, Dark Horse, being banned from YouTube for a discussion of ivermectin, which, if you've been following any of the COVID politics, is, a new sort of potential treatment for COVID-19. I hope mentioning it here doesn't get us banned as well. But, in discussions, that Dr. Weinstein, who's a biologist, was trying to have about this, idea, YouTube was like, no, this discussion is not allowed on our platform. And, in looking into this, Taibbi goes into other just insane instances of people being banned from YouTube for discussing the same thing. And I think the critical distinction here is this, this is not a crackpot, telling people to eat a Tide Pod. This is not, people engaging in sort of reckless, self-treatment options. These are actual doctors talking to other experts. And this has been the case for multiple bannings. So just some instances he lays out, in addition to Weinstein, Dr. Robert Malone, a former Salk Institute researcher, credited with helping develop the mRNA vaccine technology. He was suspended from LinkedIn. Pierre Corey, the frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance doctor, had his appearances removed from YouTube, and potentially the creme de la creme, Satoshi Omura, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on ivermectin, had his video removed from YouTube for discussing it. And so, it's an interesting discussion because, even if you want to get into the merits of, what should be allowed on these platforms, and not, I think when it comes to science, you're getting into a new territory here, because science, as we've discussed before, is a line of inquiry that depends on debate. It only moves forward by overturning previously established narratives. And the last thing I'll say, a point that Taibbi makes, which I think is so critical here as well, is that when you have private platforms like YouTube, which again, one of the most dominant speech platforms in the world, second biggest search engine beyond Google, not to mention, its video capabilities. When you have platforms like that are basing speech regulation on government guidelines, those government agencies also have self-interest, right? In many cases, they are also regulatory captured by pharma, by other, interests that they regulate. And so you're really seeing this, it's not just YouTube colluding with, liberals in the government, it's the government also colluding with elite industry to effectively censor any kind of criticism that could come at it from the most dominant speech platforms in the world. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer, I think, here of speech concerns, which I think go to shut down critical inquiry in America in ways I think we're only just starting to see sort of boomerang around. So I guess I'll just throw it open. Are we in a new era of censorship where you have industry plus government plus speech platforms colluding to, shut down any sort of line of inquiry or criticism about even product or treatment?
I think the answer is clearly yes, right? I mean, we started to see this obviously in kind of the recent FOIA uncovering. What was it, BuzzFeed or Washington Post? It's kind of like early stage COVID, right? We saw like Fauci and Burke kind of emailing back and forth with Zuckerberg and other people talking about what should and should not get out there. I mean, it was literally like February or March. It was right at the beginning of COVID. So look, I mean, we talk a lot on this show about kind of this like pan-institutional society-wide ruling class that is both kind of government, it is private sector. What does quote unquote private sector even mean anymore? It increasingly seems like. I want to take in like a slightly different direction though. I'll kind of stick to my bread and butter lane of the law. The 35,000 foot altitude, like the high level macro view problem that's going on here, is that our Constitution and our rule of law in general, not always, there are some exceptions, but our constitutional order more generally is predicated on fear of state action. But as we see on this podcast, basically every week, when the problems are coming from quote unquote private sector companies, our constitutional order, or at least as the constitutional order has been interpreted or misinterpreted or misconstrued by judges, administrators, bureaucrats, whatever, oftentimes is not neatly applied for the problems. So that is what all this kind of intellectual energy on kind of on the right is currently happening. The Federal Society has this freedom of thought project. It's kind of like it's like a 5 or 6 part series about how to kind of like reconceptualize various kind of legal paradigms, whether it's Section 230, antitrust, common carrier regulation, et cetera, for the age of kind of big tech tyranny. I participated in a ethics and public policy center, a big tech symposium. I was at Section 230 panels. So that's kind of all of what we're doing right now is we're trying to think how to apply previous paradigms, whether it's common carrier, section, antitrust, whatever, for the new threat that is emanating from the quote unquote private sector. But I just want to briefly read from an op-ed that I probably read for before in this podcast, but it's important enough where it's worth kind of reiterating this point. It was a great op-ed in January in the Wall Street Journal. It was called "Save the Constitution from Big Tech." It was co-written by Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a biotech entrepreneur and is kind of semi-retired from what I can tell now, and kind of the tender age of 36 or 37 is kind of devoting his life's work to kind of opposing wokeism, and increasingly wokeism is synonymous with big tech. So he co-wrote this with Jed Rubenfeld, the Yale Law School professor. So this is just straight law right now. So the op-ed says, it is, quote, axiomatic, the Supreme Court held in Norwood versus Harrison, this is a 1973 case, that the government, quote, may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what it is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. So, for example, the government cannot just say, like, we are going to delegate to a purportedly private actor to censor you when it wouldn't be able to do that itself. This is kind of bread and butter, Marsh versus Alabama. It's kind of a case from the 1950s. A private town in Alabama tried to kind of, proscribe First Amendment freedoms. The court said you can't do it. So that is kind of the brave new world that we are entering into right now. All this is going to continue to play out more and more in the courts. So we'll see. But, like the judiciary right now, at least until Biden, transmogrifies it like he definitely intends to do right now, might not be a super, super terrible route, at least given the panoply of Trump judges. But, fool, I might look like a fool for saying anything positive about the judiciary. That's for sure.
Well, I'll jump in briefly and just say the speech concerns raised here really implicate power concerns. At the end of the day, shutting down dissenting views on any number of topics is ultimately about incumbents seeking to protect and preserve their power and privilege, which is also a theme that we kind of always go back to here. What does the ruling class exist to do? Perpetuate and grow its power. If speech proliferating on platforms ends up undermining their power and prestige, calling into question the credentials that they've so hard to lavish on themselves and to protect the sorts of fiefdoms that they control today, then it must be shut down. And I see specifically, we talk with the coronavirus being one way in which the speech controllers have sought to exploit an event in the real world under the guise of public health to shut down dissenting views. And of course, specifically here in science, a place where there has to be free and open inquiry and discourse if we're to have any progress. And there are already a ton of troubling signs that that is increasingly not the case at medical journals, in medical research, and beyond. Entire fields are not being able to be probed precisely because of political concerns, namely wokeism. But it's the same thing on the national security side. Under the guise of national security in January 6th, you can't talk about elections anymore. So I see public health and national security concerns as being the two levers that will be pulled now in a whole variety of areas having nothing to do with either public health or national security to shut down speech the ruling class doesn't like. And I think that's a theme that we ought to look to and hammer home as the weeks and months go on, and this anti-speech regime continues to crystallize and metastasize.
I'll just add, I think it's time for us to start thinking long and hard about something that's very difficult to quantify, which is the extent to which the ruling class is actually really neutering us and neutering our ability to resist this sort of oligarchy that makes it impossible for us to even talk about these issues. So when all of the incentives in society are stacked against conversation, are stacked against doing what Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang have done, when all of the incentives are stacked against that, it becomes very easy to just sort of bulldoze culture. And the ivermectin example is a really good one. It's a terrifying one, though, because there are some incentives on Substack and on Patreon right now. So like Brett Weinstein and Joe Rogan and whoever else wants to talk about ivermectin has a financial incentive to do so because there's a huge demand that Substack is capitalizing on, right? Like you can make a ton of money on Substack now as an already established journalist who is undercutting the official narrative when it comes to things like ivermectin. I bet the traffic on Taibbi's post was awesome. Like I bet a lot of people read that, and that's a good thing. The question becomes, we're fighting back right now. The question then becomes, do we get to a point, are we in a race against the clock? Or do we get to a point where that becomes so difficult, that dissent is so impossible, that when things like the Hunter Biden news emerge in the waning days of an election, it isn't that more people end up seeing it because the platform shut it down, but it becomes that nobody sees it because the platform shut it down. And we have to be very cognizant that right now we're in a moment where that isn't the case, but we're fighting to prevent it from becoming a case. And I think, we sort of know that in the abstract, but I do think that gives these conversations much more immediacy, and it places more responsibility on all of us to actually have those conversations and to actually push for those spaces to be open to us. And so that's the ivermectin example is like a terrifying one, but I do think it underscores that point. And unless, Rachel, you have any final thoughts, we can go ahead and toss it over to Josh.
Sure.
Okay, great. So from one kind of wokeism threat to the other, I guess, a recurring theme perhaps of this podcast and many of our podcast episodes. So critical race theory, from my perspective, it's kind of like the issue. It's kind of gripping the nation right now. I can't tell whether I live in like a bubble sometimes, whether like it really is kind of the issue gripping it, but at least from kind of like our like very online Substack reading perspective, it really does seem like kind of the issue gripping the nation. So the conversation over the past, 2 to 3 weeks, month or so, has kind of, at least in kind of right of center circles at minimum, has kind of shifted from, are these laws or is this kind of pedagogy, is this indoctrination bad, which everyone at least claims to more or less believe, to whether or not we should actually use the levers of the state to ban this. And for purposes of this conversation, let's stick to education. Obviously, critical race theory and kind of corporate America, military, there's lots of conversations here, but the conversation is really kind of centered around what to do in the context of education, most specifically K through 12 public education, but we could talk about colleges and universities in general. Okay. So we're recording this on Wednesday, July 7th. Earlier this week on July 5th, so the day after July 4th, a four-headed byline of the New York Times, Camille Foster, David French, Jason Stanley, and Thomas Cheriton Williams wrote an op-ed entitled, quote, "We disagree on a lot of things except the dangers of anti-critical race theory laws." The purpose of this op-ed is basically to say that, this may or may not be bad. They purport to all believe that this is a bad thing, but it does not rise to the level that we should use state power to ban it because of First Amendment reasons, suppressing free speech, things of that nature. Funny enough, on that same day, July 5th, I had an op-ed in the New York Post, we didn't plan this out or anything, entitled, quote, "Why America Needs to Ban Critical Race Theory in Schools." So no surprise as to where I'm taking this conversation. But I guess from my perspective, This argument that in the year 2021, to kind of use kind of a Claremont Institute adjacent term and what increasingly appears to be kind of a late stage republic, a republic kind of teetering on the brink. I think the viewpoint kind of espoused by this four-headed New York Times byline, for which David French certainly has emerged as kind of like the leading proponent of this viewpoint on the right of center, is dangerously naive. I think it is really dangerously naive here. It is such an extraordinarily doctrinaire view of the First Amendment in order to basically say, and to be clear, I don't want to misconstrue the op-ed. The op-ed does say that some of these laws may or may not pass constitutional muster at like a narrow level, but they kind of appeal to kind of a broader ethos of free speech. Here's the problem. The problem is that if you want to appeal to that kind of like Voltaire-esque, I will defend your right, to say whatever you want to say, and I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. If you really want to take that, you've got to take that to its logical conclusion here. I sincerely hope that David French, Thomas Chariton Williams, and these other people would also oppose statewide bans on teaching Holocaust denial in the schools. I would hope that they would, oppose showing students like Daily Stormer, like straight up neo-Nazi stuff. Obviously, I don't want any of that garbage like in the schools, but I also would expect intellectual consistency from these people. And more generally, what's going on here, my friend and former colleague Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire has a whole new book on this, which I have not read yet, but I very much look forward to. I think the right has kind of fallen down this rabbit hole of free speech maximalism, which frankly is just, from my perspective, not a particularly conservative stance. It's definitely a libertarian stance. It's definitely kind of like an Anthony Kennedy and Citizens United, like the best remedy to bad speech is more speech kind of stance. I think a much more kind of traditional view of speech is that we should feel more comfortable engaging in the moral worth of one's speech. And to kind of give like a concrete legal example here, one example that I use when I talk about my like jurisprudential stuff, common good originalism, is Justice Alito had a sole dissent in a case called Snyder versus Phelps. It's a 2010 or 2011 case. Phelps, who has since passed away, was the founder of the horrifically bigoted Westboro Baptist Church. And he kind of, he infamously kind of protested military funerals, God hates homosexuals, like all of this stuff that I think was quite rightly deemed bigoted, extremist, hate groups, whatever. So he was doing this from a public sidewalk at the funeral of someone who died in combat overseas. And the court rules 8-1 that he has a free speech right to do that. Alito dissents and basically says like our traditions like would not even countenance the possibility that this is considered to be constitutionally protected speech. And that's kind of the recurring theme, it seems, of Michael Knowles' new book. The right has kind of gone down here. And the rhetoric of cancel culture more generally, I think, kind of plays into this for better or for worse. Cancel culture kind of implies that like all views are necessarily equal and must be platformed. That is total hogwash. Not all views are synonymous. Some are actually wretched. Some are terrible. I would say that anti-white, anti-Asian, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish bigotry, which is what critical race theory is, does absolutely rise to that occasion and is totally and wholly within the power of the states to ban that. Now, the devil's always in the details. Some laws will be better written than others, but I just think this kind of New York Times op-ed French view is just dangerously naive at this point, but I'm happy to kind of throw it open and get off my soapbox at that point.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and none of them are really conclusive because it is such a difficult issue where you have this intersection between, I think, the free speech maximalism that has become in the era of political correctness that is aligned against this like politically correct regime that is aligned against conservatism, which, by the way, a lot of this isn't even actually politicized conservatism. It's just common sense and decency and normalcy in the country. Things like biological sex. That's not conservative, but it is a target of political correctness. So as that has increasingly happened, you see the sort of old concept when we had the Tipper Gores of the world testifying in Congress. It's a very different time. And so I think it is difficult. I'm personally a free speech maximalist, but I also see that like even a free speech maximalist believes in responsible legal boundaries when it comes to things like hate speech or yelling rape in a crowded theater, fire in a giant crowd. Even a free speech maximalist, for the most part, that is a libertarian anarchist. Even the most of a free speech maximalist probably believes in those boundaries. So then we have to say, to what extent does the weird bastardized version of critical race theory that's being taught to like 5-year-olds, where does that play into this? We have the Civil Rights Act in this country, and one of the arguments that David French will level, or Camille Foster, and I like Camille Foster a lot, but one of the arguments they level is that we already have these things, so go through the court system. And Ben and Rachel probably have thoughts on that, and Josh weighed in on it, but we have these things, go through the court system. But let's not pretend that we don't have plenty of laws on the books that are meant to enforce things like the Civil Rights Act. That's something that people pass laws on all of the time to make those statutes more effective and to give them more muscle. That's something that happens all of the time. So I don't see how any of this legislation, some of which I do think goes too far, but the concept here of emboldening existing statutes, I don't see how that's like out of the question or like a wildly progressive thing to pursue. And so on that note, I'll toss it over to Rachel or Ben.
So I just find the French argument here, which essentially distills to, well, to the point you just made, if you don't like what's happening, then sue, right? I just find that very insufficient for what these parents are dealing with right now. And I think, as much as they have the courts to access, they also have their rights as parents to go to board meetings and to, advocate for the curriculum they want to see for their children, which in fairness, David French also says that, right? Advocate for your curriculum change, which I agree with. But in the absence of that, if you're faced with a school district that is intractable on that point, then I just think saying, okay, well, hope you have enough connections and money and decades to sit in court to solve a problem that should be solved with our existing laws already. We're a party that, and I'm sure David French in many other scenarios champions federalism. And here we have it working. And he's like, no, right? And I don't think it's mutually exclusive, right? I think, Emily, you're probably right. Some of these laws probably do go too far, but you are allowed to criticize those laws while also saying this is something that we should care about. And this is something that states, if they feel so moved, should act to protect the students that are currently going through schools, because this is not like some random corporate inquiry, right? Corporate law. This is the formation of citizens. And there's no greater thing than we should care about than that. And so, I think when parents absolutely are doing the right thing to go down and say, this is a problem, and if you're not going to act, I'm going to try to get my state legislature to act. The last thing I'll say, and I know we're kind of short on time, is that I do think a lot of these arguments about critical race theory misunderstand. And I'm just going to say that's my good faith interpretation of what they're doing, is just not understanding how this is being taught, because they treat it like it's a biblical lit review or something, that it's an interesting theory of the world. And that's not how it's being taught, right? It's rises to the nature, as Chris Rufo has pointed out, almost to compelled speech, where you're forcing white children, biracial children to, declaim themselves, to say, to hate their own whiteness, right? That is not an interesting theory of the world. That is compelled speech, which we shouldn't allow. So that's just my take, Ben. I don't know if you have a different one.
Yeah, not only compelled speech, compelled racially discriminatory speech in state institutions funded obviously by our tax dollars.
Right.
The notion that this is a free speech argument when it comes to public schools specifically, I think is a total dodge and straw man, and it illustrates the weakness of the pro CRT side of this. If we're going to put our priors on the table, I definitely tend towards the more free speech maximalist sort of position. But this is not a free speech issue. This is an issue of state institutions and the state being able to determine via the taxpayers' representatives the content of the curriculum. That's manifestly a state issue. And of course, there ought to be laws around what that content consists of, and especially when it comes to something as reprehensible of a philosophy that would undermine the very state that's funding these institutions in the first place. So of course, we're not going to use taxpayer dollars, or we should not use taxpayer dollars to fund not the teaching of an ideology, but indoctrination into an ideology that is manifestly antithetical to the institutions themselves. And the last thing, from a purely practical perspective, that we have to ask is, what is the purpose of the public schools? And it is to make good citizens, thoughtful citizens who will contribute to the betterment of a more perfect union that CRT aims to eviscerate. So I just think that so many of the arguments being leveled here are total straw man, dodge arguments, and free speech is a weak one masquerading as a strong one.
So let me just make two very quick final points, then toss right back to Ben for our third segment here. Real quick, I'm happy that Emily gave Camille Foster a shout out. We recently just had him on my other podcast, Newsweek's podcast. He was a fantastic guest. So I definitely don't want to come off as if I'm personally attacking Camille. The substantive point, and this is kind of what Rachel is saying, it's a really important point to make actually, is that litigation takes time. I mean, this is it's not like these court decisions come in overnight.
And money and connections. They take all that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. They take everything that the generic mom and pop down in Arkansas or Idaho, whatever, it doesn't have easy access to. But the point that I want to make real quick, and then we'll send to Ben, is that this is not the first time that David French has made this categorical error, which is really interesting because he made his career as a litigator. But literally last summer, after the Bostock case on Title VII, David French basically said people are, saying this is a death blow to religious liberty for no reason. Religious liberty is undefeated in the Supreme Court, and it has generally had a good streak in the Supreme Court. But what Ryan Anderson said in response was dude, you're missing the point here. Even if they're going to come out with a very John Roberts-y narrow ruling that applies only to the plaintiffs and has no broader application whatsoever, it's litigation. It's going to take time. These people are suffering. Look what's happening to Barron L. Stutzman out in Washington. But I'll cut myself off there. This stuff really frustrates me, honestly, as a lawyer, because it's just so naive. But Ben, let's send it over to you. Tell us about the Chinese Communist Party's hopefully highly inglorious 100-year anniversary.
Thanks, Josh. And I should say, I appreciate you publishing this piece that I wrote at Newsweek on this very topic. It was titled "The Chinese Communist Party's Legacy at 100 Years is One of Profound Evil." And you're not supposed to use words like evil or good in today's society where everything is painted in shades of gray. But I think at every turn, it's imperative that we call things by their name and we acknowledge their true nature. And I lead off this piece by talking about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party essentially is celebrating its 100th anniversary with shutting down freedom in Hong Kong in terms of free speech, with the news about Apple Daily, as we've spoken about recently. Of course, over the last year, we've seen the blood on China's hands of people from all over the world due to the Chinese coronavirus that emanated on its shores, that it sought to cover up, that it sought to exploit at every single turn, where it's threatened to withhold pharmaceutical supplies if you dare tie the coronavirus to the Chinese Communist Party itself. And this is a perfect way for the Chinese Communist Party to be celebrating its 100th year, because its entire history is one of profound evil. It's one of kind of the ultimate woke regime in some respects, with an anti-cultural revolution that happened decades before ours. And I go through in this article in Newsweek the nature of the evil of that regime, starting with, for one thing, the massacres of Mao, the Tiananmen Square massacre, of course, the genocide today, the horrific social engineering of the one-child policy that now China is frantically trying to reverse because of the disasters they've inflicted by trying to play anti-God in society. And then even the fates that the Chinese diaspora face today, where their families back home are threatened to the extent to which they use their natural right to free speech to speak out in ways that don't comport with the Chinese Communist Party's narrative. So they're sort of the ultimate dominant ruling class, controlling every single aspect of society. They're murderous, they're corrupt. They've used every single advantage that we have provided them in the West against us. They've played on our naivete and our greed. And I sort of juxtapose the direction that China has gone, its evil in these 100 years, with where we are celebrating July 4th, only 3 days after the July 1 anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, to basically say China represents the greatest external adversary that we face. But the worst adversary that we face is ourselves, to the extent we adapt analogous American versions of the principles that the Chinese Communist Party itself has used to threaten us as our most formidable adversary. And we see this, of course, in this sort of tech surveillance state that in some ways we have imported in America. We see it in the speech codes that are being imposed. We see it in our own anti-cultural revolution over the last year. We see it in the state working hand in hand, as we've talked about in this episode, with pseudo-private or actually private entities to pursue wrong thinkers in every single aspect of society. And that to me represents the far greater threat ultimately than communist China, because if America musters all of its capabilities and skills, I believe firmly, and it's not just cliche, that we can overcome any potential adversary. But if we're engaged in self-righteous suicide and we put wokeism above all else, including our own survival, then we will ultimately lose. Our adversaries won't overcome us. We will kill ourselves. So I put forth this sort of somewhat provocative argument, I guess, in the hopes that on July 4th, we ought to look to rekindling the values and principles that are directly antithetical to the ones the Chinese Communist Party has imposed on the Chinese people and under which the Chinese people have languished for decades. And I throw out to the group, for any thoughts on comparing and contrasting July 4th versus July 1st and what the future augurs to the extent we continue going down this road to serfdom in every single respect.
Let me read a quote from President Xi's speech at the Tiananmen Square celebration. At the same time, the Chinese people will never allow foreign forces to bully, oppress, or enslave us. Whoever nurses delusions of doing that will crack their heads and spill blood on the Great Wall of Steel built from the flesh and blood of 1.4 billion Chinese people. He also said, there was actually a chanting of slogans that included this, according to the New York Times: listen to the party, be grateful to the party, and follow the party. Let the party rest assured I'm with the strong country. Let it not be lost on us that this is happening in Tiananmen Square. It's always important to consider symbolism when we're looking at what the CCP is putting forward in very public facing events like this one. So for Xi to come in, and by the way, before he said the whole thing about the Chinese people never allowing foreign bullies to oppress or enslave us, he says the Chinese people have never bullied, oppressed, or enslaved the people of other countries, not in the past, not now, or not in the future. Okay, so while he's talking about people China's opponents spilling their blood on the Great Wall, he's in Tiananmen Square, which his own government and he himself has relentlessly sought to erase from the Chinese consciousness and from history in that country. Talk about spilling blood. And the whole conversation here about how the Chinese people have never bullied, oppressed, or enslaved the people of other countries. This is him talking about, this is like a direct response to allegations from people in the West, conservatives here in the United States and Democrats even here in the United States, about the human rights abuses that are happening in China right now. But it's also trying to erode the moral authority of other countries like the United States when they make those criticisms. We saw that happen in Anchorage with heads of state. Actually, it was Blinken, I believe, early in Blinken's tenure. And so when you actually look at the words that are coming out of Xi Jinping's mouth, it is like an incredible contrast between the United States. It's so Orwellian, the way that they're talking about the party. And for us to even think for a moment that we should rest and let another country treat its people that way with our money and the freedoms that our corporations enjoy, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and let me just add to that, and then I'll let you go, Josh. I should say one of the things that I point out in my article is that essentially we have to look at every single business transaction that we have with a Chinese entity as doing business with, underwriting and subsidizing the ultimate evil regime that wants to dominate us and supplant us in the world. And until there's a broad-based understanding of that, China's going to be light years ahead of us. Anyway, feel free to go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, we did a whole segment on Hong Kong last week. I feel like I was kind of just emoting on camera about the horrors of what's going on in Hong Kong and the national security law. So I don't have a whole lot to add here. I'll make just kind of 2 points. One thing that the Chinese Communist Party has been brutally effective at, since the struggle sections, the Great Leap Forward, going back, decades and decades, is they have taken what is an incredibly rich, vibrant intellectual civilization going back thousands of years. They built the Great Wall, obviously. They had Confucius, they had Tao. They had, Sun Tzu, like one of the great military strategists in human history from like the BC era. And they've taken that and they have so indoctrinated their people so as to basically forget what made their own civilization great in the first instance for a very long time. That is basically to kind of weave these strands together here. I mean, that's more or less what the CRT folks are trying to do. That is kind of more or less what kind of the woke mob is trying to do. I think there are really kind of direct parallels, frankly, between kind of the woke movement, what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology, where kind of CRT indoctrination is kind of a very visible public tip of the spear. That's basically what they're trying to do. It's great for us to oppose communist China abroad, which we obviously should do. It's a great issue of our time. But on a domestic front, we need to oppose kind of its direct analog to kind of weave these two segments together. And the only other quick point I'll add here, Ben's written a lot about the so-called national strategy for countering domestic extremism, or whatever Orwellian term the Biden administration is using. I have a piece coming out this week, I think, at Claremont's American Mind site, kind of giving my own take on this document. The parallels between the rhetoric and the euphemisms that kind of come out of this document compared to kind of CCP dogma and orthodoxy are quite chilling. Talking about kind of surveilling the citizenry, trying to stop at kind of a pre-radicalization stage, which obviously can only happen with kind of, closed circuit cameras everywhere. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's easy to see where this ship is headed if this sort of thing were to take off. So it's really great for us to combat the CCP abroad, and we absolutely must and should do so. But let's also combat what is the domestic analog of the CCP, which is literally currently happening before our eyes.
I think everything, I obviously agree with a lot of the points that have been made, but what I always come back to when we talk about China is that we are facing all of these issues with a country, half of which, or at least the administration leading the country, doesn't really seem to quite grasp the state of the issue. You had Joe Biden as a candidate who wouldn't even call China an adversary. And, on top of that, regardless of who's in the White House, you have an entire sort of corporate structure that is, and corporate law that it incentivizes these companies to do exactly what they're doing with China. And until we actually fix those structural defects, and by that I mean, an aggressive foreign policy against China, and I don't mean a war, right? I want to be very clear that those two things are distinct. But you can have an aggressive posture against China without resorting to the military, and then in addition to strong public policy that supports companies who don't want to do business in China, right? But who's all the economic factors right now kind of push them in that direction. Now, I think that decisions could be made in corporate boardrooms that are not being made, and I think they would be financially rewarded at home. But until we actually fix these structural problems, we're not going to successfully stand up to the Chinese state that has no compunction and complete control to do whatever it is that they want to combat the United States. And so I actually do think that as much as this is a sort of the great moral issue of our time in so many ways, it's one of the most pressing public policy concerns we face. And I do not think I've seen anybody take it seriously. You had the Senate sort of hand wave in that direction with their sort of China competition bill, which it didn't really do anything except fund some high tech research at National Science Foundation, which a great, compelling area, but sort of drop in the bucket to what we need to be doing. So, I do think we need lawmakers who are going to propose some pretty big ideas, and I think the Biden administration just has not taken any creative approaches that I've been inspired by so far. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, and might seem like an unlikely transition here, but a lot of the companies, by the way, that have good business in China are, I think, at least partially complicit in what we're going to talk about next. And that's how this kind of brings us into, as Josh said earlier in the episode, the sort of pan-institutional rot. And that's why I say this is going to sound like maybe a jarring transition, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Our last topic is talking about the male friendship deficit. And I'm going to read from a National Review article that went sort of viral on the right. It's talking about a survey from the Survey Center on American Life. And here's what it says. This friendship recession is particularly bad for men. The percentage of men with at least 6 close friends fell by half since 1990, from 55% to 27%. The study also found the percentage of men without any close friends jumped from 3% to 15%, a five-fold increase. Single men fare the worst. 1 in 5 American men who are unmarried and not in a romantic relationship report not having any close friends. So what that means is that the isolation is actually worse among the people who are most isolated. That's kind of like a twisted way to say it, but the people who are suffering from isolation also tend to have less friends. So if you're not married, you're also likely to have fewer friends. So that means if you're lonely, you're just going to keep getting lonelier. And this conversation is super important because it brings us all together with the civic institutions and social capital. And that when you look at what happens when men in particular don't have jobs, the death of sort of the company town, which is maybe a little overly nostalgic and a little overly romantic, but there's something very true about stable work and cities that are based around particular industries or communities that are based around particular industries. When you take that away, you get a whole lot of isolation, and then you get all of these sort of cultural ramifications downstream of it. These things work together. It's not just as though economic decay is causing the cultural issues. The cultural issues also exacerbate and worsen the economic decay. But the point is, we've had corporations. I mean, you could go to all of the trade deals. You can just talk about everyone that has started doing all of this stuff overseas or in Mexico compared to in the United States. And they say, well, we're making a lot more money. Well, that money is staying concentrated up at the top at higher levels. And on top of that, the side effect of taking the manufacturing or taking all of those jobs elsewhere is that you hollowed out massive communities in the interest of lining your own pockets. And so great, like capitalism is good. Lining the pockets of executives sounds awesome. It sounds like something that will ultimately benefit people, and a rising tide will lift all of the boats. This is not what we've seen happen. And the cost of those increased profits for the people at the top has been social capital down the chain. It hasn't just been money. It's been social capital. And so the friendship recession is, I think, very, very, very clearly downstream of this. You have tech companies who are making all of this even worse. I shudder, and I mean this, to see what happens when this reaches Gen Z and when we have more information on what's going on with Gen Z and the kids that are even younger than them. Now, I'm not a man, so I'm curious to hear what Ben and Josh have to say about that, although the male category is, of course, becoming increasingly less distinct. But I'm curious what you guys think about this.
Well, wait, before they're allowed to answer, I'm going to woman-explain my view on this. I'm just kidding. I actually just want to make one quick comment. Well, actually, two. And the first is I'm always impressed about how Emily can transition us from China to the male friendship deficit.
It's all connected.
Just like brilliant, brilliant work. But the second thing that I want to briefly say, too, is that, I completely agree with your point that, the sort of economic and cultural sectors transact upon each other, that they just do. And I think the right too many times tries to treat them as separate when they're clearly not. But it's interesting. Chris Caldwell has written, obviously, a fantastic book on unpacking the legacy of the Civil Rights Act. And one of the things he sort of gets into this, and I think Helen Andrews actually put a very, very fine point on it recently when she said, looking at this problem, she said, wow, maybe this wouldn't be a problem if we hadn't made exclusively like male organizations illegal. Right. We've actually removed with our own policies the ability of men to gather in certain areas. And now, obviously, you're getting into a ton of things where, sure, have they been discriminatory and abusive and all these things? Yes, we can bracket that off of the conversation and acknowledge it while also acknowledging how that's changed our social fabric. So that's my hot women's planning take. And I'll let the men talk now.
Yeah, I mean, I can just talk on. Sorry, I'm having a hard time not laughing. It's just, but like, I could talk about personal experience a little bit, I guess. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I have found it difficult to keep up with friends from previous eras as I kind of grow through different phases of life. So in my head, I kind of very roughly categorize, here are my childhood friends, which ended up being my high school friends. Then I have my college friends, and I have my friends from college semester where I studied abroad in London, a whole group of other friends. And then I have my friends from, living in DC between college and law school, then law school friends, and legal networking friends, then Twitter, conservative friends, all three of which you are. So congratulations. So as you get older, it's just harder to keep up with these friendships, right? It's very difficult to maintain them. I've kind of learned this the hard way kind of over the years. Maintaining friendships really does take work. I guess the point that I want to make here, to kind of bring it back to kind of like the realm of like public policy and everything happening in the world, is I really worry that these trends are only going to be dramatically exacerbated if kind of like the Zoom work from home revolution kind of takes hold. A lot of people have written, frankly, not enough has been written about like what the mid to long-term societal effects of this probably will be if it does take hold, which it seems to me like I see every indication that it will. Rusty Reno had like a blog post, I think it was last year, kind of speculating how this will ultimately lead to kind of like a decrease in kind of innovation and entrepreneurship, because a lot of those conversations kind of happen at the proverbial water cooler in like a larger company, and they kind of spawn off to start their own thing. That seems eminently plausible to me. But what seems even more intuitive and obvious, frankly, is that this kind of just like Zoom, sit behind your computer screen all day culture is only going to like make this atomization, loneliness, despondency crisis worse. And it really is a crisis. I mean, Ben Sasse, whatever criticisms we may have about him, most of which I'm sure are justified and merited, he's written about this prolifically, and I think he's absolutely right to do so. And this kind of gets to a slightly broader point. We're not going to have time on this segment of this podcast. Maybe we can come back to it in a future segment, or possibly even final thoughts today. There's kind of like a broader debate going on between kind of like very traditionalist conservative thought and kind of more kind of neoliberal libertarian thought, whatever you want to call it. We saw this play out. Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal hosted like a mini debate of sorts between Oren Cass and George Will a few months ago. And they were talking about like, what do you do about like these Rust Belt towns that have just been like totally like devastated, decimated by quote unquote free trade, i.e. not very free trade with China and places like that. And George Will's answer to that was basically just like get up and move to where the jobs are. Where the jobs are, where the social capital is, where the people is, where the community is. That cannot be the conservative response. It has to be a much thicker, more kind of robust response to that. I don't actually know what that looks like at a level of granular detail, but like, things like industrial policy, or at least kind of getting closer to kind of getting to the solution. But these are at least the debates I think we need to be thinking here. And I think, with strong jobs, with kind of, especially kind of like manual, kind of like labor intensive jobs, that kind of naturally conduces to less loneliness over time. I think at least.
Yeah. So let me go back to the sticking on the theme of the evil of communist China. Once again, first, there's the outsourcing of the jobs. Then there's the dominating all of the strategically significant industries after hollowing out our industrial sector, which hurts us militarily and in a whole host of other realms as well. Then there's flooding these areas with fentanyl so that you get people addicted, and you further destroy the human capital in many of the Rust Belt areas that Josh was just referring to. So there's definitely a China tie-in here beyond our woke corporations who at the same time kowtow to the CCP. I don't have a lot in the way of answers here, except to say that it is really kind of a paradox of our time that it's never been easier to stay connected to people all over the world. And yet the depth and richness of those relationships seems to be in many cases non-existent. Like, you're communicating with people, but it's not the same as an in-person relationship, and you can't recreate an in-person relationship via text or email. And I say this as someone who has all sorts of relationships that are almost entirely digitally or text-based in large part. And it's a great thing about the technology, but at the same time, there is this loneliness and desolation that appears to exist in large segments of society. And we can't even begin to ponder what ultimately the generational consequences of all of this are going to be, particularly, as I mentioned in a prior episode, when it comes to prime working age males in particular, what it does to family formation and what all of those social maladies will be down the road as a consequence of it, what the causes are, and what, if any, role there is to play of the state in it, are all issues that are so far beyond the scope of this article. The one, I guess, sort of kind of happy thing I'll say on the topic is, or a piece of advice, news you can use, is join a fantasy league with your male friends. It's kept me and my high school friends, really elementary school friends, together for 20 years competing in fantasy baseball. And for that, I'm very thankful for the advent of that digital technology.
Rachel and I are in a fantasy bachelor league. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. That show is garbage. The Kardashians are much better. So on that note, let's go around the room and get everybody's final thoughts. Who wants to go first?
So one last thread I'll pick up on from my segment at the very, very beginning, which I think sort of links to some of the things we were talking about this, sort of mega corporate, control and it's how it's sapping the vitality from our communities and, linking us closer to China. I think one aspect that links back to what I was talking about, which is how YouTube sort of punishes or, dissent of any kind, is that this specific case with ivermectin is a leading indicator of what I think we're about to see, which is the sort of intellectual capture of these regulatory agencies by businesses, right? Businesses will now be able to work with the government regulators, which they are many times in bed with, right? We know this, one of the key insights of conservatism is that these things tend to happen. They are now not only going to be able to buy regulatory relief, but broad preemption of criticism, right? This is on a vaccine right now, but can you imagine, any other sort of regulated entity, which is basically all of them, being able to say to these, well, you should work with, YouTube or these speech platforms because it's really dangerous for people to be talking about the fact that our cars crash or something, right? Like this is the road that kind of we're going down. And so I think, again, you're seeing this entrenched speech control become entrenched business control, not just of their own competitors, but of dissent at large around their own products. And this is a whole new level, that we're seeing, I think, which we need to watch out for. And that's my 2 cents.
So I'm happy to just kind of extend a little bit from the earlier discussion about David French and time and litigation and kind of make it a little more personal. So it's just like one very concrete example that I lived out over the past week as to the time of litigation. And why this so-called remedy that the New York Times 4 co-authors is so woefully inadequate. Last Friday, a U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit opinion came down that I was one of the co-plaintiffs on, and we actually won. This was a lawsuit that I was first approached to join basically 2.5 years ago. It's been a long time. The time from the district court opinions, the federal trial court to the appellate court was well over a year, a year and a half in minimum. So just for the data points as to just how silly it is to just say like, oh, take it to the courts, but talk just very briefly about what the opinion actually is. It's a free speech claim. I somewhat ironic, obviously, given that we were talking about speech earlier. But basically, what we did, and I'm still a barred attorney in Texas, so I was kind of a natural plaintiff for this because I don't actually practice a whole lot of law there, so I don't necessarily care about retaliation from the state bar. We basically filed a First Amendment lawsuit against the State Bar of Texas, and we basically said that the 2018 Supreme Court Janus case, where Justice Alito, writing for the court, basically said that a labor union cannot force you to pay dues to that union in such a way that those dues will be used to kind of fund political interests. We basically just said that exact same law, that same First Amendment claim applies to the State Bar, because the State Bar of Texas is engaging in kind of political activity. They're trying to do all sorts of like diversity initiatives and like immigration, like clinics and stuff like that. And to make a long story short, it's a little complicated, but we won. And I was optimistic. We got an extraordinarily high energy panel of 3 judges, and it was a unanimous opinion. I think it is the first federal court, to issue a ruling of this sort. The 10th Circuit recently came out the other way, creating what lawyers call a circuit split. So I'm actually optimistic this could eventually make it up to the Supreme Court, which is pretty cool. But just flagging that for the listeners, it's a little in the weeds, but this eventually, if this actually holds, if the court grants cert and hears this case and the rulings affirms, that same logic will apply to many industries, not just the State Bar. But it actually really could be deeply societally meaningful. But just kind of flagging that on a somewhat self-promotional note for the listeners.
Just to briefly follow up on that point that Rachel made about kind of policing dissent within corporations, this goes right back to my point about the US converging with China. China has Chinese Communist Party cells, political cells within their companies, increasingly making business decisions, actually, which might in a perverse way serve to our benefit ultimately, that if the central planners are more in charge of their businesses. But we see the same thing here. We have light versions of it, softer versions of it. But to Josh's point as well, in the way of using national security to impose political ideology, just like the national security law that China imposed on Hong Kong, you see echoes of that when you have our own national security apparatus talking about combating disinformation and misinformation in public discourse. So I think if you want a measure of the health of American society, look to whether we ultimately diverge from going down the path of the Chinese Communist Party, or whether our ruling class continues to ape it. And I suspect it's going to continue to ape it all the more strongly as it tries to cling to its power, as at every single level, it undermines itself, as the institutions undermine themselves by their own actions and by their unwillingness to be open, transparent, and accountable to the people who they seek to rule. So one measure of health of society, are we more like communist China or less like communist China? A simple heuristic that we can use. And the only other thing I'll say in terms of measuring the strength of our society and the direction of our society is look to people who actually make decisions that are apparently not in their short-term self-interest because of the long-term benefits to them. And if our woke corporations, our financial services industry, our purported political leaders and beyond really are good, moral, and just as they claim to be, and they try so staunchly to be and ardently to be, then let's see them call for a clean break and a decoupling from communist China in every strategically significant area, no matter what it does to their top and bottom lines for potentially a long period of time. Until and unless they do that, talk is cheap about how good they are and their purported care for social justice.
Okay, so I'm really glad Ben ended on that point, because that was going to be really similar to my final thought, which is it's been one of the things with the community breakdown is that it makes it so much easier for people whose business is hurting others to just see it as business instead of to see the human consequences of those transactions. So of course, it's always true that money sort of blinds people and greed blinds people to the consequences of it. But when we're sort of more atomized, constantly more atomized, and suffering is reduced to pixels instead of our very real everyday lives, and when the person who you are laying off by moving the factory is not someone who lives in your community, is someone who you've passed on a tour of the factory floor once, but isn't somebody who sits at church with you because you don't go to church with, or isn't in the bowling league because the bowling league just doesn't exist anymore, or isn't doing, I mean, it's like there are like Xbox leagues that probably have now replaced bowling leagues, and you can say, well, time changes things, but it's a very different experience, obviously. And so this is partially because of technology. It's partially because of globalization, but it's kind of probably time for us to start reframing some of these conversations to say, are you really happy with what you're doing? Like, how do you sleep at night, right? Like get into that and just say, are you really happy with what you've done? Do you see hedge fund manager? Do you see private equity manager? What has happened to this community? Or you can say that to the person who sold to the private equity firm or to the hedge fund. And I think it's time for us to start sort of speaking, not just asking these questions because people have been asking these questions for forever, but to start speaking in these terms and framing these issues of business as issues of human dignity and social capital, because those are the real consequences. Friendship is something that people, it literally affects your everyday life. I mean, the pain and misery that people are bringing to maybe the drudgery of their white collar jobs is informed by this atomization. And I think it's time for us to start thinking about these issues in that way. But that does it for us on this edition of NatCon Squad. On behalf of Ben, Rachel, and Josh, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.